Kvass. Malcolm, is that showing up good for you on the screen? Perfect. Okay, so definition of kvass. So like Malcolm was saying and Denis before, kvass is a fermented drink, mostly known from Eastern Europe. It is especially popular in Russia, and it is made from bread. Now, often rye, it's low in alcohol, and it's sweetened. Yeah. Well, I got a trick for you, Malcolm. He's giving me the thumbs down for no alcohol. I got a trick for you. So it's another definition is a slightly alcoholic beverage, Eastern European, mixed from and fermented from a mix of cereal grains. Now, my definition of kvass is it's a fizzy, slightly sweet, slightly acidic, slightly beer-like, low to non-alcoholic beverage, similar to kombucha, jun, or tibikos, also known as water kefir. Now, in its essence and essentially what kvass, traditional kvass is fermented bread tea. Now, I know this doesn't sound too appetizing, bread tea, but just stick with me. It will blow your mind. So if you don't have 2 pairs of socks on, you might want to double up because they're about to be blown off. So I went over this slide here. So some history about kvass. So it's a common drink, Eastern Europe, from Russia. It's been around since the Middle Ages. I just need to minimize this. I think this will work if I... Okay, I think that's better. Now I can see my screen totally. Sorry about that. Been around since medieval times, 5th to late 15th century, and it really developed as a way to use up or recycle, like I said before, old stale sourdough bread. Now, any bread can be used. You'll find on the internet they're often talking about rye only for kvass. That is not true, and you can use any type of bread for kvass. So as I mentioned before, it's non-alcoholic or a low alcohol content. It's typically about 0.5% to 1% alcohol, 1 to 2 proof. This is if you use a sourdough starter culture. So when you use brewer's yeast, so this is a shout out to Malcolm, when you use brewer's yeast, you can get the alcohol percentage up to about 8%. So it can be pretty heavy duty. I don't really drink much alcohol ever at all unless Malcolm has me over and starts feeding me some booze. But so for me, this low alcoholic drink is fantastic. I get a beer-like taste, a beer-like flavor. I can brew it slightly, tiny bit sweet if I want to. All the rewards of drinking that traditional fermented ale, but without the alcohol content. Now that is because I'm using a traditional starter culture. If you did want to use brewer's yeast, then you can produce alcohol from it. So really it's fermenter's choice and whatever works for you. I will say that the starter culture is going to give you a plethora of bacteria, yeast and bacteria that you're not going to get from the brewer's yeast alone. So I do suggest using the starter culture. Now, kvass is literally one of the most nourishing tonics you can consume. So if we think about drinking beer, we know that it's very filling, right? It's very sustaining. There's a lot of nutrients in it. Well, we get those same benefits with kvass, but in a low alcohol format. Kvass is typically also low calorie, if that is of interest to you. So it's like a light, low calorie, low alcohol beer. So also very economical to make, but it's a nourishing tonic to get a lot of vitamins and minerals into the body. Now, this is an especially, in my opinion, an especially important skill for the sourdough baker to master. Because if you're a baker like me, you're going to have little bits of bread laying around, little ends in the freezer, and you can kind of keep those and put them, in a bag in the freezer, save them up, and start brewing kvass at your leisure. So it's a wonderful way to recycle that bread. But also what I find, and more important, or a more important aspect of this, is it's a wonderful way how you can consume your sourdough starter, your culture of bacteria that you've been taking care of and nurturing in a raw, unbaked, uncooked format. So when we bake the bread, there's a little bit of debate online. There's a little bit of research behind this. Some of the lactobacillus apparently does survive the oven. I don't know how much faith I put into that. There's differing of opinions. Again, it's going to be about temperature over time. But when you're consuming kvass, you're taking this in a raw format, using this bacteria and creating something that's amazing. Now, I find sourdough starter, and I'm going to talk about this more going forward, is a very aggressive ferment. So when we compare it to our kombucha, our jun, those types of scobies, I find that the sourdough starter, or the sourdough culture, or it is a SCOBY because it's a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, is the most aggressive, most robust out of them all. It is hard to kill, easy to manage, and just amazing. And you can start it from literally flour and water. So you can start it at any time. Now, if you're not a sourdough baker, you might want to experiment and get into it, but you don't have to. You can do kvass from store-bought breads. Sourdough is what I would recommend, obviously, but don't feel pressured that you need to be a baker to experiment and adventure with your kvass brewing. Because really, if you have any sort of access to bread, you can just easily get some starter, manage it, and go from there. So don't feel overwhelmed that you need to be a baker to proceed. Now, the only thing about it when you're brewing it is you usually want to choose breads that have some sort of maltose content. There's specific grains, which I'll get into further, for the maltose content. But even if you have white bread, and I'll mention this later, which usually has a low maltose content, the yeast and bacteria work together that they split the starches up to create maltose. Now, maltose is just a double-bonded glucose molecule. So it's just another form of sugar. But when we think about brewing beer and ale, we want that malt flavor. Well, the maltose also feeds the lactic acid bacteria. So the lactobacillus bacteria do prefer the maltose, but really any type of bread is fine. Whatever you can get your hands onto, you just want to get a good quality starter. And we'll talk about that moving forward. See if I can, no, there we go.